First up, I would like to introduce Ian Hussey, and his presentation is entitled Boom, Bust and Consolidation, Corporate Restructuring in the Alberta Oil Sands. Ian is a research manager at Parkland Institute. Before joining Parkland Institute, Ian worked for several international development organizations, including as the co-founder and executive director of the Canadian Fair Trade Network. Ian holds a BA Honours degree in Sociology and in English from Acadia University and an MA in Sociology from the University of Victoria. His PhD courses and exams at York University focused on sociology of colonialism and on political economy. I'd like to welcome Ian.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here today. My name is Ian Hussey. I am a political economist with Parkland. I am seconded almost full-time to a federal research grant called the Corporate Mapping Project. You may have heard of that. We've been publishing off the grant at Parkland for a few years now. Most recently, last week, we published a report by this title, Boom, Bust and Consolidation. And so I'm going to run through some of the findings of the report. My presentation probably take about 15 minutes, so I want to cede a bit of time to the floor because I would imagine folks have some questions or comments themselves. So want you to have time to be able to ask them or make the comments. Who are the 5 major oil sands producers? You probably have heard of most or all of these companies. Suncor, by far the largest oil sands producer. It's really in a league of its own. CNRL is the second largest. Cenovus, Imperial, and Husky round out what we call the Big Five. A large part of what our report is about is the actual business economics of these companies. All of these companies are either vertically or horizontally integrated. And you're like, oh, what does that even mean? Vertical integration means that a company has oil production, which is upstream. They have midstream facilities, which is refineries and upgraders. And they also own downstream assets, which is gas stations. So if you're vertically integrated, you're operating in all those levels, which is basically a license to print money, as is the case with Suncor, Imperial, and Husky. All 5 of them are horizontally integrated. What that means is they're actually operating across the fossil fuel sector. So some companies like Suncor are predominantly an oil company, but they would also have assets in ethanol or natural gas or asphalt. In the case of Suncor, they've actually owned wind farms since 2002. Other companies, various mix of those things, natural gas, ethanol, asphalt. Husky, for instance, has the largest asphalt facility in Western Canada. I believe it's on the Saskatchewan side of around the Lloydminster area. The most important thing about these companies, as far as their ability to make money, largely for their shareholders, is that they have midstream assets or refineries in the US. So they're all multinational companies, and they either own or own 50% of certain refineries in the US. So Husky owns a couple of refineries in Ohio. Suncor owns a refinery in Colorado and a connecting pipeline from Wyoming. Who else? Cenovus co-owns refineries in Illinois and Texas. And so largely, when the media talks about Alberta oil, they say, oh, we're selling all of our oil to the US, as if like we are somehow developing the oil as like everyday Canadians or Albertans. In fact, it is these businesses that are developing the oil, and quite a bit of the oil they're actually selling to themselves. Or moving to their own refineries in the US. And so when the oil price is low for our grade of oil, which is called Western Canadian Select, that means that their feedstock for the refineries or their upgraders, either in Canada or the US, is cheaper. So they're getting a cheaper input to then upgrade to various derivatives of bitumen. So how dominant are these companies? In fact, very dominant. What's ended up happening over the last few years since the oil price crash started in mid-2014 is these companies ended up buying even more productive capacity than they owned before. And so now, at this point, they own about 80% of bitumen production, which is 2.86 million barrels a day of bitumen production out of 3.6 million barrels a day. Overall, Canada produces about 4.2 million barrels of oil. Most of that, of course, is bitumen. A bit of it is conventional. Conventional oil has been going down for the last 3 or 4 decades, in fact. They also own 90% of bitumen upgrading, which is largely happening in Alberta. By industry speak, upgrading and refining are actually related, but not quite the same thing. So here we're talking about upgrading, and yeah, they own almost all of it. So they are not only dominant now, they're positioned to be dominant into the future. However long Alberta is producing oil, likely these companies are going to continue to be involved and continue to be the main players. What we've seen over the last few years is, of course, a number of international companies have pulled out of Alberta, and especially Suncor and CNRL used the downturn as an opportunity to buy assets that were relatively cheap, given their actual economic value. So in a sense, when we talk about the oil sands, these companies are the oil sands, largely. And Husky, in fact, is in the process of a hostile takeover of MEG, which would make this group of 5 companies even more dominant in the oil industry in Alberta and in Saskatchewan, because Husky and some of these companies are also active in Saskatchewan, of course. So, this was some of the stuff that ended up catching the eye of the mainstream media when we released the report last week. How much money do these companies make? In fact, a trash ton of money. The Big Five's aggregate revenue is $115 billion. So that means all the money they're pulling in for 1 year, this is last year, $115 billion. For context, our government's revenue last year was a bit more than $47 billion. These companies' revenue is more than double our government's. And some of the media were like, oh yeah, but they're multinationals, maybe some of the money's coming from, I don't know, like natural gas in Northeast BC or whatever. No, in fact, the Alberta oil industry is incredibly profitable. There's a lot of money to be made. And these are the companies that are largely making it, and they're largely making this money off of Alberta oil. So once you get through all their costs, their net income is almost $14 billion, 13.74. Their assets are worth almost $280 billion. For context, Alberta's annual gross domestic product, all the activity in Alberta's economy for 1 year, is about $300 billion. So their economic power is largely related to how much assets they own and what, in fact, those assets are. Then you think like, oh, well, we had an oil downturn. I mean, these guys are crying poor in the media. They don't have a lot of money, right? They're not making a lot of money. Their profit margin probably not that high. Well, in fact, last year, Cenovus's profit margin was the highest of the Big Five, and it was almost 20%. Coincidentally, Cenovus also cut, in relative terms, the most workers out of the Big Five during the downturn. They cut 25% of their permanent employees. Suncor and CNRL are making almost 14% profit last year. And you think like, okay, almost 20%, 14, like what does that even mean? Well, all businesses in Canada, the profit margin was less than 8%, 7.8%. These companies, because of their integration, because of the assets they own, are incredibly profitable. They're more than double the profit rate of the average business in Canada. And then, of course, 2015, as we all know and lived through, was the worst year for job losses in Alberta since 1982, which was another oil downturn. And just in 2015 alone, 20,000 Albertans lost their jobs. Where does the net profits go? You think like, oh, hey, yeah, we get some of that money from government. most of the money doesn't actually come to our government or the federal government. It actually goes to shareholders. Last year alone, shareholders collected $6.2 billion from these 5 companies. So that includes shareholder dividends, which is our payments that companies make to their shareholders, as well as they bought back a number of shares that they had released to the market. So that total is $6.2 billion. They also banked $7.3 million, which of course, or billion, sorry, $7.3 billion. So they can invest that money in the future if they choose. They probably will at a certain point. In the case of Husky, what they did in the last couple years is, over the last decade, Suncor doled out the most dividends to their shareholders. Husky was actually number 2. And for the relative size of the company, that is punching above their weight. And it's in part because of the assets they own. But Husky in the last 2 years, if you look at their dividends over time, and I have a table coming up on this, it almost goes down. It goes down from like $1 billion a year to like $30 or $40 million, and you're like, whoa, Husky must be broke or whatever. In fact, Husky is owned. The majority shareholder is a dude named Li Kai-sheng, who's a Hong Kong billionaire. He owns 70% of Husky. And so it's mostly Li Kai-sheng's decision what to do with those. Do I want to collect my dividends for each year? In the last couple of years, Li Kai-sheng has said no. And we know, I believe, in my opinion, why now? Because they're in the process of taking over MEG, which would actually basically double their productive capacity for bitumen. And so they have foregone paying as their normal rate of dividends for the last couple of years in order to make that substantial asset purchase of taking over MEG. And then, we get to governments. Much of this money would be collected by the government of Alberta. You have the total of about $4.7 billion. So that shakes out that the government take, largely Alberta, but a bit federally, and then some assets in natural gas would be, let's say, in Saskatchewan or BC or Saskatchewan Oil. So the government take overall is about a quarter of the money of the net profits. About 3/4 of the money goes to shareholders or the company's bank accounts. And as you can see, $1.6 billion for income taxes is a bit of a joke, isn't it? Given that their overall revenue is $115 billion again. This I cut from the PDF of a report, so it's a little fuzzy, but I think it's not too bad. This is the Big Five's capital expenditures over a 9-year period from 2009 to 2017. And you'd say, like, oh, that's a bit weird. Why would you do 2009 to 2017? And the reason for that is Cenovus was created in 2009. It used to be part of Encana. Encana basically split in 2009 to Encana, a natural gas company, Cenovus, an oil company. You may remember back in the day, Encana was actually originally the Alberta Energy Company, which we as Albertans owned. Wouldn't it have been sweet to own a company of that size? Because Encana now is the second largest natural gas producer in Canada. They were overtaken by CNRL during the downturn when CNRL went on a buying spree of like 12,000 natural gas wells in a couple-year period during the downturn because they bought the wells for pennies on the dollar. Anywho, this number here is the real sort of headline. Over the last 9 years, these 5 companies have spent $196 billion on developing capital. That means developing their assets, their facilities, their ability to produce bitumen or natural gas or ethanol or whatever. And as you can see, the two largest companies by far is Suncor and CNRL. You have a sort of second tier of Husky and Imperial, and then Cenovus is really the lowest at about $21 billion. So they're $11 billion less than any of the other 4 companies. Oh, sorry. One point that was at the top is, so the peak in spending was in 2014. And you see a real progression from 2009 through 2014. You go from 14 billion in capital expenditures in 2009, which was low, obviously, because it was the year of the financial crisis. Then you have an immediate uptick the next year. The economy starts to come back a bit. They're at 21 billion. They eventually reach 31 billion, almost 32 billion in 2014. And then, of course, we have our oil crash. In the second half of 2014, oil as a commodity lost half of its value in a 4-month period. This is why Jim Prentice called a snap election, because he knew this was going to shake out. And so by the spring, we were already in recession when we were having our 2015 election. And the 2017 total is only about 50% of the peak in 2014. And we're never going to see 30 billion again in spending. That's just not in the cards in the future. Yeah, there's fewer jobs, but the shareholders are still doing all right. So this chart, this table is the dividends paid to shareholders over the same 9-year period. And again, you see Suncor is in a league of its own. It's almost 11 billion. And it's interesting to look at the companies. If you have a bit of time to look at this table in the report on our website, to actually look at how their dividends have changed over time. And so Imperial at the bottom is the lowest of the 5 companies, but their dividends have increased every year over a 9-year period, including through the downturn of the last few years. The same with Suncor. They've increased every year over the 9 years. They've also gone from 400 million in dividends in 2009 to now 2.1 billion last year. That is a chunk of change. And again, as I was talking about Husky, they've cut their dividends in the last couple of years because they want to make this play to take over MEG. CNRL, you see, dipped down after the downturn in 2016, but then they bounced back last year. Cenovus still having a bit of issues, and I already talked about Imperial. They're doing all right. They've increased every year. So I believe, this is my second last slide. So in Alberta, we hear a lot about the carbon tax. We've obviously had a carbon tax on large industrial emitters since 2007, when the Stelmach government brought that in. That's changed a bit under the NDP. They increased it slightly. They changed a bit of the details of how the tax actually works, and they introduced a tax on home heating and transportation fuels. Hate to break it to you, but a carbon tax is really not going to get us where we need to go as far as climate change and decarbonizing our economy. It's going to require government regulations, and it's going to require something like taking the NDP's 100 megaton emissions cap. That's 100 megatons. Is a nice way of saying 100 million tons of carbon emissions attributable to the production of Alberta oil. That is not attributable to the burning or the end use of oil. It's attributable to the production. Right now, we're at about 70 million tons attributable to our production. We will reach the 100 million cap around the end of the 2020s. And unfortunately, the government hasn't actually brought in the regulations tied to this legislation of 100 megatons. So the legislation's actually been sitting on a shelf for over 2 years. I think they might be a bit gun shy on that one. But there are ways to actually reform that legislation, if we so choose, to decrease our emissions over time. So you could say, you could immediately reduce the cap from 100 million to 70 million, which is our current level, and then you could reduce it a couple megatons each year to go down to zero over a 20 or 30-year period. You could allow industry to grow to 100 million tons, which is actually a really bad idea as far as climate change effects, and then decrease it over time from there. Again, going down, a few megatons a year. These are things that the government is certainly aware of. They've decided not to do that. The companies themselves they're not going to regulate themselves. They're not going to reduce their amount of emissions or amount of production. In fact, they have plans to increase their production over the next number of years and over the next couple decades. And so there, at this point, is a number of platforms internationally, some run by nonprofits, some run by international governmental agencies, to do with the disclosure of climate information from companies. And so one of them is formerly called the Climate Disclosure Project. It now just goes by CDP. And so researchers are able to look at the filings, the voluntary disclosures of companies, and they actually have questions in there like, hey, are your climate plans, are they tied to science? And the companies will just flat out just say no. That'll be the answer. There won't be like a detailed answer. It'll be like, nope, not based on science. So that's how we know this information. They've actually voluntarily disclosed it. And so they have no science-based plans or targets to get to the amount of decarbonization and the amount of reduction in production that would be related to that to get to a scenario where we would be talking about 2 degrees of global warming. And they certainly have no plans for 1.5 degrees of global warming. You're probably aware, but 2 degrees of global warming is a heck of a lot worse for climate change effects than 1.5 degrees. So that's why the Paris Agreement, as an aspirational document, is aspiring to 1.5 degrees global warming compared to 2. You're probably aware the world on average has warmed 1 degree so far. And as Angela said earlier, the UN's scientific panel recently came out with a summary of research that said we are going to breach the 1.5 degree global warming mark between 2030 and 2052. So it could be coming as early as 12 years from now, and likely is coming way before 2050. The only realistic way for these companies to reduce their emissions is to reduce their production. There's only so much carbon intensity you can take out of bitumen. It is a very carbon intensive fuel. It is more carbon intensive than most oil that's produced in the Western Hemisphere. So, industry will talk about, oh, hey, there's going to be this amazing technology that's going to come online. We haven't really thought of it yet, but it's totally happening like, a couple years from now. And that's how we're going to reduce all these emissions. And it's like, yeah, my 5-year-old nephew believes in Santa Claus too, so that's awesome. But realistically, they need to reduce production to reduce their overall impact to do with emissions. And the Paris Climate Accord, of course, means that business as usual is not an option. So right now, on an international level, countries, including Canada, who are signatories of the Paris Agreement, as most countries in the world are in negotiations for how to really operationalize the Paris Agreement. And will binding targets be put in place, and those sorts of things are what's being negotiated by countries right now. So we don't quite know the answer to that. Want to transition now to my last slide, which is more what Emily is going to be talking about, which is talking about just transition. So just transition is a concept I believe Lynn, maybe last night, some other people have mentioned. It might be something that you've heard of. You might not really know the details of that. The AFL is running a campaign now called Next Alberta, which is related to the idea of just transition. The idea of just transition, in short, is really ensuring that the folks who are not responsible for the climate issues we're dealing with right now don't bear the brunt of the costs that are already happening and are going to continue to happen. So this would be our coal workers in Alberta. It would also relate to oil and gas workers when we eventually talk about phasing out the oil industry, which of course no one is talking about phasing out overnight because it is a substantial part of our economy still. But As you would have seen in the Next Alberta campaign and maybe some other places where you access media, just transition or transition away from oil, it sounds like a really scary thing. It is actually a massive economic opportunity. It is, besides the original theft of the Americas, the land, about 500 years ago when this land was colonized, this is the single largest economic opportunity in the last 500 years. That's how, we're talking about trillions of dollars, tens of trillions of dollars. And Alberta can be part of that. And what we're going to be doing in the next couple of years of the corporate mapping project, people like myself and Emily and some other folks, is actually looking into how would this happen? Where are the jobs of the future? And those sorts of questions. But generally speaking, we do know, again, I think Angela mentioned this morning, there are thousands of jobs that are possible in a greener economy. In not only the healthcare and education sectors, but also cleaning up the pollution of the land that has happened because of the oil and gas industry. And you may have seen headlines recently that the current estimated liability to clean up Alberta's oil wells is, what is the figure? Do you remember? $260 billion. So, you know, that obviously that's a huge sum of money. But it also means there's tens of thousands of jobs connected to cleaning up the land and also building more renewable energy. So we're already starting to triple our renewable energy between now and 2030 in Alberta. And in fact, we could go beyond that. We could go beyond natural gas to having enough energy from renewables to heat our homes and run our industrial facilities and all that stuff. We can also minimize the impact of that on workers, say in the coal sector, the oil and gas sector, by involving them in the new economy. A lot of workers want to be involved, of course, in future jobs. They realize that things are changing, and there is a place for these workers. And of course, we need to continue to communicate that message, that they are definitely included. They should be a core part of a just transition strategy. So thanks for listening. I'll turn it over to Emily, and then I'll take your questions in a bit.
Thank you very much, Ian, for your wit and your candor and for sharing your expertise with us in such a real and understandable way. Our next presenter is Emily Eaton, and the title of her presentation is Just Transitions in the Belly of the Beast. Emily Eaton lives and works in Treaty 4 on the traditional territories of the Cree, Saulteaux, Nakota, Lakota, Dakota, and the homeland of the Métis. She teaches in the Department of Geography and Environmental Studies at the University of Regina. Her work concerns the political ecology of resource extraction and the politics of just transition to a post-carbon economy. She is also active in social justice struggles around resource extraction, Palestine solidarity, and access without fear. Please welcome Emily.
All right. Thanks so much for having me here. I am going to talk mostly about Saskatchewan, and that's because I've been studying Saskatchewan's oil economy since 2011. I originally grew up in Saskatchewan. After I finished my PhD at the University of Toronto, I returned for a job at the University of Regina. And at that time, in 2009, we were in the middle of an oil boom, and there was nobody studying oil in Saskatchewan, and all eyes were on Alberta. So I kind of took it as my duty to investigate Saskatchewan's second largest oil producing economy. But I think that we have, in many ways, of course, there are also differences, but we have a lot in common with the province of Alberta. And I think that Saskatchewan, alongside Alberta, is one of the largest, potentially one of the largest obstacles to getting serious about climate change. But also, I think if we can do it right, and if we can begin to have the right kinds of conversations and the right kinds of policies around just transition, we can also be real leaders. And I think that if we are going to do if we are going to be serious about climate change, and as Ian mentioned, that does mean phasing out the fossil fuel industries over time, that it has to be provinces like Alberta and Saskatchewan that are leading those conversations, right? It's not going to happen if it comes from Ottawa or Ontario or BC or wherever else. So on this opening slide, we just hosted a Just Transition conference in Saskatchewan a couple weeks ago. And this was the lovely, what do they call these? Graphic notes that one of the participants made of the first morning of our conference. And you'll see in the middle there is Simon and Emily. We need a 3D transition: decarbonization, decolonization, and democratization. And I'm going to be talking about that today. But first, I want to start by giving you a little bit of a context about Saskatchewan and about Saskatchewan's oil industry. It pales in comparison to the size of Alberta's, of course. We do have tar sands in Saskatchewan, but they haven't yet been exploited. They're, too deep to mine and too shallow to use steam-assisted gravity drainage. There was a lot of interest for a while in developing the right technology, but the oil prices fell, and I think they're kind of off the scene for now. But we produce about 486,000 barrels a day, or we did in 2017, 12% of Canadian crude oil, and that's roughly about the same size as Alberta's conventional oil industry. So we have an oil industry that's about the same size as your conventional oil industry. As a share of total provincial GDP, the fossil fuel industries account for 19%. So that's a very significant chunk if you look at sort of definitions of petrostates. They usually suggest 25% qualifies you as one indicator for being a petrostate. I would argue that Saskatchewan's actually a rentier state. We have more than, we're dependent on more than just the extraction of fossil fuels, but also heavily on potash and uranium, but the same sorts of effects where a lot of our government revenues come from resource extraction and not from, it's not as bad as in Alberta, but not as much from income taxes. So as a percentage of total government revenue contributed by oil and gas here, just oil and gas, it ranges, of course, depending on the price of oil. It was at a low in 2015 at 12.3%, and at a high in 2009 at 23.8%. So again, getting into sort of petro-state territory. And the fossil fuel industries in Saskatchewan account for just over 15,000 direct jobs, or 3% of our direct jobs and about 6% of our indirect jobs. But of course, that's highly dependent on where in the province you are. And there are many rural communities that are, 85% dependent on oil and gas. Some differences with Alberta, but I think we're in the same sort of territory in certain ways as Alberta. This is just to give you a sense of what we produce in Saskatchewan. So you might have heard of the Bakken Formation, runs into North Dakota as well. It's in Saskatchewan. It was driving a lot of the horizontally fracked wells in the 2000s. But we produce, everything from medium to heavy oil around the Lloydminster area and the border with Alberta, to light oil. Much of it is produced through horizontal fracking. I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I don't think you're super, super interested in Saskatchewan. And I want to get to just transition. But just to give you a sense again, this is unfortunately the most recent one that the ministry, they used to publish these every year and they've kind of stopped since 2015. But, and that's only part of 2015 too. That's only till March 31st. But you can see that we've been drilling, if you take out the lows, around 3,000 wells a year in the province. And so a lot of the boom that was associated with the mid-2000s and the early 2010s was around drilling activity. And here, just a breakdown of of the different types of oil. So heavily dependent on heavy oil, which is only a few grades lighter than bitumen, actually. So we get to escape some of the, how would you call it, attention from environmentalists on bitumen, but actually our heavy oil is very energy intensive to produce and very greenhouse gas intensive. So the point that I wanted to make today is that in many ways, Saskatchewan has looked to Alberta for its resource policies. And one of the things that Saskatchewan has been concerned with actually is beating Alberta. And so we have not only looked to Alberta for our resource policies, but we've also tried to be more lenient with our regulations and to provide a better atmosphere for investment. So what you do in Alberta is really important to us in Saskatchewan in terms of what types of regulations you implement. Flaring and venting is something that Saskatchewan's looking at now, and we're looking at Alberta's regulations. And so to the extent that you can implement the most stringent forms here, that is a big benefit to the rest of the country as well. So if you look at our friends from the Fraser Institute, that was a joke, they produce every year a global petroleum survey. This one's from 2017, the most recent. And you can kind of see here in their policy perception index, they survey people involved in the upstream oil and gas industry, and they ask them from companies, different positions from companies, about their perceptions about a range of things, including regulations and taxation and a bunch of other things, labor conditions. And this is their ranking of every jurisdiction across the world. And Saskatchewan has slipped, actually. A few years ago, it was number 3. But you can see here that Saskatchewan, and this is one thing we've been really priding ourselves on, not me personally, but the province, about being one of the most attractive places in the world to invest. And you can see we're still very near the top there. And of course, Alberta has slipped, especially since the Notley government was elected. This year, they broke down the survey into small reserve holder comparisons, of which Saskatchewan counts, and we're number 2 after Kansas. And if you look at the policy perceptions just in Canada, again, Saskatchewan is a very favorable environment. You can see, for example, against Alberta, that companies actually really love producing in Saskatchewan. We provide a very stable regulatory environment for them and a very favorable business climate. Thanks not only to the Saskatchewan Party, actually, it was going on much before that with the governing NDP before that, but certainly Brad Wall and now Scott Moe have been very very favorable towards the oil and gas industry. So moving now to thinking a little bit about energy and climate change. Saskatchewan has the highest greenhouse gas emissions per capita in the country now. We surpassed Alberta a couple years ago. In some ways, that's hard to believe since you've got the tar sands, right? And we're at 66.1 tons of CO2 per person per year. And you can see Canada and the world average there. So although Canada only produces less than 2% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions, and Saskatchewan's only a small percentage of Canada, I would make the case that per capita, because we're such huge emitters, that if we don't do our part in Saskatchewan and in Alberta, that we're forcing that on somebody else somewhere else in the world, for whom it's much harder to find those same gains. And if you look at this graph, I think it was published in ripped it off of a National Observer piece. But if you look actually at the last several years, most provinces in Canada have managed to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, and that's been fully offset by 2 provinces, Alberta and Saskatchewan. So again, the case for sort of just transition and for getting serious about climate change, as Ian mentioned, has to include the tar sands. It has to include Saskatchewan, I believe, as well. And it has to involve transitioning off of fossil fuels. There's no path to 1.5 degrees Celsius or even 2 without doing that. I'm trying to be speedy here. But of course, I guess Alberta is in this. You are both in it and not in it, I guess, at the same time, right? Not quite in it yet. But of course, Mo is one of the biggest threats from Saskatchewan to any progress that's being proposed by the federal government in terms of climate change mitigation. And our former premier, who everybody knows much better, Brad Wall, has, as I understand it, a new job in Calgary as a special advisor for the law firm Osler, Hoskins, and Harcourt. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. So after many years of saying that, the Sask Party was bringing people home from Alberta back to Saskatchewan because of the great economy, less than a couple of months after he resigned, he finds himself working for a law firm in Calgary who has advised Kinder Morgan about the Trans Mountain Pipeline. So this is all just to say that in another lecture talking about sort of the influence of the fossil fuel industry, we can see it in a serious way in both Alberta and Saskatchewan. One of the reasons that the picture in Saskatchewan is so devastating is because of our oil and gas industry. And you can see there, 31% of our emissions, this is a few years old, in 2014 came from mining and extraction, and most of that from the upstream oil and gas and mining industries. 17.4% of our total greenhouse gas emissions come from waste from one industry. That is just mind-boggling to me anyways, right? So at this point, when I am teaching and we're talking about climate change mitigation, and students naturally think about riding their bikes more and hopping on public transportation, I say, we're not going to get anywhere near any targets as inadequate as the ones that we have are if we don't do something about that 17.4%. That's waste. Fugitive emissions are emissions that escape from wellheads. In Saskatchewan, we're mostly producing oil. They find gas at the same time. It has to be extracted alongside the oil. And then it is either vented in the better case scenario, but often in Saskatchewan, flared in a better case scenario, but often in Saskatchewan just vented into the air. And it really bothers me because I have colleagues in the United States who are studying fracking in Pennsylvania, where landscapes are being ripped up in order to produce natural gas. And here we are in Saskatchewan, producing it as a byproduct of oil and venting it or flaring it into the air. That also includes emissions from pipeline leaks. So all of this is, I guess, to make the point about how important it is to tackle the oil and gas industry as part of climate change mitigation, but also how difficult that's going to be because of the political power of the oil and gas industry, both in Alberta and Saskatchewan. We produce in Saskatchewan about 75 million tons of CO2 equivalent per year. And the Saskatchewan government has released a few plans. They're resisting the carbon tax. They have, don't have time to get into it. I calculated that what they are proposing in the plans that they've released would get us to about 63 million tons, if they actually do what they've promised, by 2030. The green one there is where we would need to be in Saskatchewan if the Paris targets applied to us as a province. And I had to update this a few weeks ago because the new IPCC report came out suggesting that we actually need to be about 45% below 2010 levels by 2030, which means we would need to be at 38 million tons. So you can see the gap in reality here, right? This is where I want to talk, to be into transition to talk about just transition. In February of 2018, together with 2 colleagues at the University of Toronto, we conducted an online survey of 500 adult residents in Saskatchewan on energy energy politics in the province. And it's broadly representative. I know that our first presenter today suggested that the online survey isn't the most trustworthy. According to Randy Besko at the University of Toronto, new research is showing that they're competitive anyways with phone surveys. But this is, just a small snapshot, right? And there hasn't been anything this substantive that's been done in Saskatchewan about what people think about energy politics. And we know that people hate the carbon tax. It's almost the same story as it is in Alberta about how much people in Saskatchewan hate the carbon tax. I didn't bring the numbers on that one, although I have it in the report here. But I think that we found some really surprising things in that survey. One of them was this question, these 2 questions, that we asked about whether Canada should do more to support the development of clean energy and clean technology, even if it results in an increase in energy costs. And you can see that we get above, we get into the 60% territory with somewhat agree and strongly agree. And that governments should take necessary action to protect the environment, even if such action could result in an increase of energy costs and hurt some industries. So this is a very interesting finding, I think, because people don't seem to want to bear the increasing costs of energy in the form of a carbon tax, yet they seem to suggest that they would be in favor of higher energy prices. But I think the key message there is also even if it hurts some industries. So if we look at, Ian sort of mentioned this, if we look at the carbon tax as a demand-side policy, number one, it's not going to get us to where we need to be. That doesn't mean it shouldn't be part of the mix. I support a carbon tax. But I think what we've really been missing is the supply side. And I think that people feel generally that even though they're dependent on oil and gas industries, that it should be those who have profited off of those industries that pay. And so looking to some of the supply side policies, I think, is where we have a lot of room for optimistic change in the provinces of Saskatchewan and Alberta. We actually asked, would you support a transition away from fossil fuels? And we named coal, oil, and gas for the Saskatchewan economy. And this really floored me, this finding. And again, we can't take it as the very most reliable, but I think it gives us a good indication that between now and 10 years, we get over 50% of Saskatchewan people saying they would support a transition away from fossil fuels. And I think in the earlier presentations, we heard too that people recognize and understand that an over-dependence on oil, on a single industry, oil and gas, is not leaving us in the right spot, right? We're vulnerable for all sorts of reasons. So I think for all these reasons, it's really important that we start to look towards just transition policies and supply side policies that can eliminate and make big gains on some of the things we need to do. Venting and flaring just shouldn't even be allowed to happen. And it would be fairly easy to regulate it. Maybe not quite out of existence, but regulate its existence very stringently. So this brings me to what I would suggest for building a just transition movement. And I've already suggested that those sort of demand-side policies that are really asking individuals to bear the costs of the transition and to bear the costs of pollution as maybe not the most palatable to the public. And I think part of building a case for transition involves really trying to reconceptualize the fossil fuel industries as public or taxpayer liability. This is work that's already being done, for example, by Reclaim Alberta and by the news articles that Ian was referencing. So we need to think about the ways in which the infrastructure that in Saskatchewan We have right now over 24,000 suspended wells. Not each one of them will be orphaned, but that is a tremendous amount of infrastructure in the province that is a liability. We need to ensure that the oil and gas industry pays for that liability. And if we can't make them pay for that liability, it will become a public taxpayer liability. And so I think really changing the frame around what the industry is and what its legacy will be in years to come is a really important part of the conversation. And as Ian suggested, this liability could be a source of new green jobs, right? Jobs in reclamation and decommissioning. But again, the big problem is how do we get industry to pay for it? And so maybe a very far-fetched thing, maybe a little bit slightly less far-fetched in the province of Saskatchewan, is an article that I wrote with Dave Gray-Donald, who's the publisher of Briar Patch magazine. He's out there selling briar patches. The idea of, for example, nationalizing the oil industry in order to wind it down. I know it's really far out there. But these are things that we need to start thinking about, right? Because in that process, we could treat people fairly, and we could exploit the rest of our resources in an orderly manner and get the most out of them, and put that industry to bed in a just way. This was the segment of that graphic note that was taken at the Just Transition Conference, and I just liked how she represented that. But Simon Enoch from the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives in Saskatchewan and I have been talking about the need for this transition to be 3D. And people have suggested the idea of transition is still up in the air about what exactly it means and for whom. And so one thing I've been pushing for is for it to mean much more than just taking care of those workers in the energy industries. Because if you ask, like, Indigenous people, for example, who were at the summit, they were never part of the economy. So the idea of like transitioning without leaving anyone behind really doesn't make much sense. So we need to democratize. This is necessarily going to mean disempowering carbon capital in order to democratize our economies, and we can think about different ways that we might pursue that. It's really hard to think about, actually, these things. We're so embedded in the world as it is. But we need to, one thing that's already been discussed at this conference is shift state revenues towards progressive income tax. That's part of disempowering carbon capital. We need things like lobbying registers. We need divestment movements. We need these initiatives that are trying to impose costs on carbon capital, right? We need to name the polluters and make them pay. In other words, we need supply-side policies. And again, people are angry about the carbon tax because they don't necessarily feel like they are the main drivers of climate change, right? And it has been the industry's favorite discourse that, oh, we're just making what you all are consuming, and if you didn't ride your bike here, and if you don't ever have a piece of plastic in your life, then you're in no position to talk about transition. But in fact, we can look at studies that say, for example, this 100 companies have been responsible for over 70% of emissions since 1985, I think it was, 86. And we can name the companies who have knowingly put carbon emissions into the air and hold them responsible for profiting off of that and force them to help pay for the transition. That's going to be hard. It will require legislative changes. None of this is easy. I think we need to identify gains for the working class. And my friend Matt Huber has a great article on 5 principles for socialist climate politics. But again, one thing that a carbon tax doesn't do is it doesn't really name the benefit that working class folks are going to get out of this. They only see a cost. So we need to think about, and this is one of the things that Huber talks about, housing programs that aim to deliver both efficient weatherized homes and viable, affordable public housing for all, just as an example, right? So we need to build into the idea of transition that it can really benefit the working class, and we need to be clear about what those things will be. And we need to ensure that decolonization is part of it. That's a contested and fuzzy term. When I say decolonize, just briefly, I understand colonization to be the theft of land and life as a really crude definition. Therefore, decolonization has to mean the repatriation of land, sovereignty, life. So if we think about somebody like Arthur Manuel and his conception of the 0.2% economy, the idea that Indigenous people have been reduced to 0.2% of the territory that is now called Canada, which was at one time 100% theirs. One of the things that transition has to do in the process is to repatriate land and resources and grow the 0.2% economy. And that's something really concrete and easy. We can measure it, right? So I think, in discussions of decolonization and reconciliation, they can get kind of difficult for folks to wrap their heads around. But I think this is just my own opinion and one way to think about it. But I think this would be a really concrete thing that we can work towards through just transition. And we need to invest in Indigenous actions on climate change. And there's some really good work that's being done by Indigenous Climate Action and other organizations across Turtle Island. That's it. How do we want to
Do the questions. Thank you very much, Emily. Your passion for your work is palpable in the room. I think everyone can agree with that and feel that. Emily and Ian will now respond to questions and comments, and we'll do our best to utilize the time to get everyone an opportunity to speak. Okay, let's start right here.
Emily, this is for you and your lobbying.
Are you? Oh, hi.
Hi. I come from the Peace River country, and where you were talking about the venting and flaring of wells, I just will share, here is a young couple, they got married, they built a beautiful home, and he was so proud and happy that there was flaring happening from here to the end of this building over there from his house. His wife died early from cancer. And secondly, if you look at the map of big bad diseases for Alberta, in the Peace River country, we rank first and the most. Mm-hmm. Thank you for your lobbying, Emily.
I'll just say one quick thing about that, actually, which is another reason why I like supply-side policies. So I've been doing some work over the number of years in oil and gas producing communities, especially working with farmers and landowners who live beside flare stacks. And some of them were really welcoming of that industry on their land, and they've become really pissed off over time because of precisely these reasons. But one of the things that I think is really powerful about supply-side policies, this would be things like regulations and phase-outs and moratoriums and bans, is that they have the capacity for building those alliances with groups who are concerned with the local environmental effects of the oil and gas industry, but who may not be that concerned about global climate change. And so I think that that's a really productive possibility.
Hi. I'm Nancy Stewart, and I'm born and bred in Saskatchewan, but been in Alberta for 30 years. But I go home all the time to people in Regina, and I have big fights with my brother-in-law. And he says, you're fine in Saskatchewan because you're doing your carbon capture and storage. And Rachel stopped doing that in Alberta, and I said to him, it's useless. It's so minuscule what it does, and it's so expensive. But how is carbon capture and storage doing in Saskatchewan?
Well, the first thing is it's being used to pump out for enhanced oil recovery, to pump out more oil from aging oil fields. So the sort of like green footprint of it all, I think, is very questionable. But yeah, like one of the reasons I think Saskatchewan was able to do it is because we still have a Crown corporation, SaskPower, that was able to shoulder the really huge cost of carbon capture technology. And if you've followed it at all, it's been mired in all sorts of problems. It hasn't been working. They have problems with the amine solution. And so when it's on, they claim it's capturing 90% of the emissions, but it's never on all the time. And the idea that it's a solution for, like even 10% of coal emissions is too much if we ever want to stay below 1.5, right? So it's been really tough because the Saskatchewan government has been really supportive of it. The NDP before them were the ones who really started the investment there. And people believe in it.
Yes, with the fugitive emissions, the advantage of flaring off is that you turn these gases, mainly methane gas, into carbon dioxide, which we all know about that. However, there is a figure that came out, and I've forgotten just what it was, but it seems to me it was something like 38 to 40% of if you don't flare it off and the methane is released into the atmosphere, global warming is some 38 or 40% greater doing it that way, just releasing. Do you have a figure on that?
Do you know the exact numbers, Andrew, maybe?
It depends on how you calculate it. It can be 80, as much as 80%, or around 30%.
Okay. It's still too much, whatever.
Yes.
A second
Huge.
question.
It's absolutely huge.
Yes, that's right.
Much, much greater than CO2.
My other question is, what year is used as the beginning of the industrial age? I know that the steam engine was invented approximately 1704. Is that the year that is used as the beginning of the industrial age?
It's about 200 years ago. So warming on average across the globe is 1 degree over the last 200 years, but in certain areas it's higher. So I think it was Lynn last night said California, their warming has been about 3 degrees, which is in part why much of their state is on fire. Yeah, so it really depends. I mean, the 1 degree number is the average global warming across the world since the last 200 years, approximately. Indeed. And the land, although, yeah, I mean, we could get into the details of this, of how warming affects oceans versus land, but yeah, obviously we want to reduce the speed of warming and eventually, hopefully keep global warming below 1.5 degrees.
Hi, my name is Gil McGowan. I'm president of the Alberta Federation of Labor, and I have a comment and a question. The comment is a shameless plug. I appreciate Ian for mentioning that we have a campaign called Next Alberta, and we're trying to start a conversation and force politicians to recognize the energy transition as an issue that has to be addressed in the next election. And if you haven't visited the site, it's nextalberta.ca, .org, sorry. .org, nextalberta.org. Please sign up and help us make this an issue that politicians can't ignore. And second, for Emily, in addition to being the Federation of Labor president, I also was chosen to sit as a member of the Federal Just Transition Task Force, which was talking about a plan for just transition for coal workers, not just in Alberta, but in the other 3 provinces that are phasing out coal-fired power. And we discovered something because we toured the country and we met with all the energy companies. And your comment about nationalizing the oil industry as part of a strategy for just transition really tweaked my attention, because our experience was that when dealing with companies in Alberta, which were all private sector, talking with them about just transition for their workers was a nightmare. But all the other provinces, the 3 other provinces, all have crown corporations, and all 3 of them have committed to not laying off a single person. So the differences were stark, and it was because of public ownership. Mm-hmm. So if you could comment on that, if you're interested.
Yeah. That's why we need to do it, right? So in the article that Dave Ray Donald and I wrote, we were looking, because for a while in the 70s, there was a crown corporation that was producing oil in Saskatchewan. It was named Sask Oil. And so we were kind of like resurrecting that history and thinking about like how that could be a possibility for today. But I think the idea is that like as a sector, like we need an industrial strategy for the sector, and we need it to be wound down in an orderly way. And again, as you say, with a whole bunch of private companies, their interests are leaving as much of the liability on the taxpayer's plate and making away with as much of the profit as possible, right? And we don't have a lot of time left to recuperate the liability associated with the industry. So we need to take really bold actions now to ensure that we get the most out of the private companies. But I think, yeah, those crown corporations are really key. And thanks to the Alberta Federation of Labour for all the work that you've done in those coal communities, because as I understand it, the conversations don't go in a similar way in a place like Saskatchewan where nobody has bothered to show up. From the province or the opposition or the Saskatchewan Federation of Labour, nobody's been having those conversations, and they're crucial to laying the framework and the foundation for that.
Over here, and then we'll bring the mic down to the front.
Yeah, hello. Yes, many things to say to this. Question for the lady, Emily. Thank you for your advice from Saskatchewan. We've been looking at that kind of advice since the 30s, at least my parents were, on how to get through tough times. Any case, what I'm hearing out of Saskatchewan from more or less to the right there is that let's scrap the carbon tax. The solution is to invest in clean energy, in alternative energy, in wind, solar, etc. And of course, as you mentioned, that's not going to happen strictly from government, but it's traditionally being needed because of the unlevel playing field between clean energy and the fossil fuel industry in terms of government subsidies. In any case, I don't think you mentioned too much about that. If you could just address that, what's happening in Saskatchewan in terms of investment in cleaner energies, and specifically, I have a friend who lives or has background in one of the reserves, actually straddling the Alberta-Saskatchewan border, who wants to build a biomass-fueled power plant for that reserve. And so I'm kind of seeking if there's any movement in terms of biomass as a source of energy within that framework of cleaner energy.
Well, positioned at the University of Regina, where there's a lot of investment into clean oil or clean coal and green oil, I think is how they call it. I know that they are very interested in bioenergy alongside coal. This is their newest idea, is that if we can get emissions from coal-fired plants, if we can capture 90% of those emissions from coal-fired plants, we're still producing 10% emissions from coal, which is one of the most greenhouse gas intensive fuels. And so their idea to get to like net zero or negative is to incorporate biomass into there. So the idea, I guess, is that you're pulling carbon out of the air with the trees. You burn them alongside the coal and sequester the carbon. They haven't addressed the fact that it's going to push out more oil from aging oil fields. But that's supposed to get them to net zero and negative zero. But all of this stuff is very fantastical, and it all elides the problem. It elides the real problems, right? So I'm not very interested in those discussions, maybe in debunking them eventually, although it's tricky given where I'm positioned at the university. But in terms of renewable energies, SaskPower, out of the blue, committed to, well, they didn't commit to, they have an aspirational goal of 50% renewables by 2030. I think it's difficult it's difficult for folks like myself who want to see the public utility remain a crown corporation, but where the corporation has been investing in coal and carbon capture and really resisting a transition. Because in a lot of ways, sometimes the private sector does seems more eager to jump on board with renewables, right? But for the long term, and for some of the reasons that Gil mentioned and others have mentioned, we do really want to ensure that we have public control over that, and we don't want to just replace carbon capital with green capital, because the thing is, our systems are unfair, right? And I know Cadmus Delorme, who's the chief of, and I'm just blanking right now on the name of the reserve. It's they have some land just outside of Regina, and they just built the biggest solar installation with a battery in Canada, as I understand. So there is some like innovation happening. I'm not sure about the case that you mentioned, but those are just my sort of thoughts on that. I don't know.
We can take 2 more questions down here, and then in the back, please.
Yes, Gordon Laxer, founding director of Parkland Institute. Two great presentations, and thank you very much for that. Public ownership. I've for decades been an advocate of public ownership. It could be wonderful, but it depends how it's done. If we nationalize the existing fossil fuel companies, the value that you would have to pay for them is contingent on the actual continuing production of that. So you would have to pay off the companies by continuing the production. So it's important to drive down the value of those companies. I think the way to do it is to bring in really tough regulations, which they probably won't be able to meet. Drive down their value to 10 or 20% of what it is now. Only at that point would it be worthwhile to do it. A huge advantage of having a publicly owned company, especially if it wasn't profit-oriented, would be not only to be selling people energy, but to be in the business of conservation, of actually helping people to save a unit of carbon. Because it's actually better for the environment to save that unit of carbon energy than to produce one and emit one and try. So, just be careful of the way we do it. We do not want to be saddled with those old dinosaurs, because we have to get off that, and then we do not want to be continuing with it. So, yes, but do it in the right way.
Yes, and thank you. Certainly your work was an inspiration for that article.
And you get the last question today.
Hi there, my name is Heather Erlin, and my question today, we have touched a little bit on the carbon tax, which I know is a very contentious issue for many people here. And what I find hasn't been really discussed is where the carbon tax money in Alberta is going towards. So I mean, right now that money is going towards create safer water solutions on Indigenous lands, helping to get more green transit, and also to, most importantly, more green investment, green jobs, and green energy. I mean, in the conversation that we had on the economy on the other side, we had discussed that having 1 million green jobs in Canada is really one of the pillars of what we need to see if we're going to really reduce our carbon emissions. So I find it a little frustrating that we're always ready to scrap the carbon tax when it is part of the solution in transitioning the economy. And also for us to really just think above the rhetoric that we hear from the right. If we're continuing to feed into the scrap the carbon tax, I don't think that we're actually building a new narrative about what it means to be, on a personal standpoint, accountable to our own carbon emissions, because a lot of us here know that households are huge producers of carbon carbon emissions. So I do agree that the businesses are the ones that need to bear the brunt of it, but it creates a different level of accountability within our own households to talk about our own involvement in being emitters ourselves. So I'd be interested to know if you've done any digging into where the carbon tax in Alberta is going. I think that's more for Ian. But thank you for your time here today as well.
Before you start, Ian, I just want to clarify that I'm not anti-carbon tax. I just think that strategically we should be doing and putting other things, giving other things a lot more weight too.
Thank you for your comments on the carbon tax. Yeah, I mean, the carbon tax is industrial carbon tax as well as for consumers of energy. Those are important. They're sensible. They're at this point very low for environmental economists that work on this stuff. They would say at minimum, carbon tax should be actually $200 a ton, and right now it's 30. So. Yeah, that's great that we've started to tax emissions at the gas pump or to heat our homes. Certainly, as you said, the vast majority of money to pay for transition should come from the ones who have profited the most from the destruction of the earth, which is the major capitalists and not the everyday consumer of gasoline. I would go back to the point, though, that I made in the presentation. We can't get to the level of decarbonization we need without regulation, sensible regulation to do with the phase out of the production of hydrocarbons. So yes, I think it was a 5-year period when we started having a consumer carbon tax in Alberta. We were going to raise, I think it was $9.6 billion over 5 years. And so where does that money go? A lot of great things, in fact, some of which you pointed to, other ones that are critical and that will make it difficult if the UCP end up winning government for them to repeal the carbon tax. So quite a bit of that money goes to substantial infrastructure that we need and we want. So it goes to the expansion of light rail in Calgary or Edmonton or better buses. About, I think it's 3% goes to various Indigenous nations. I would say Indigenous people in Alberta are 5% of the population, so the fact that they're only getting 3% of the money is unfair. The way that the tax has been rolled out has largely pitted Indigenous nations against one another to compete for that pool of money that is not large enough. And so there are some issues with the way that the funding has been allocated in Alberta. But overall, it is a positive thing, and it took a lot of gusto for the Notley government to introduce a carbon tax. This was, as we were told by the politicians, this was part of a grand bargain, right? So as we've seen over the last couple of years, the Notley government brings in their so-called climate leadership plan, which includes a carbon tax. It includes things like the phase out of coal, which mostly was phased out by the Harper government without any transition plan. And luckily in Alberta, we have, I'll make a shameless plug. In a couple months, we're going to be publishing a report on the coal phase out, looking at it through just transition principles. And I can tell you, as a number of people have said, the AFL did incredible work in those communities to educate people, to just give them basic information. So all of these things matter. But on top of that, we need to talk about more stringent regulations about the phase out of the oil industry over the next couple of decades, if we're at all having a realistic conversation about the situation we're in.
Wow, thank you. Thank you to Ian and Emily for sharing their work and their passion with us. I would like to remind everyone to please visit the table at the front of the lobby area and complete the evaluations for the conference. Thank you very much.